I also hope that you have had an amazing day so far. All right, so for today, we'll be doing our English grade 7 lesson on semicolons, colons, and commas. So we'll be doing our grade 7 English lesson on semicolons, colons, and commas. And before we start, we're going to log into aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password. And we're going to select the subject of language arts, grade 7. All right, so once you've selected the subject of language arts, you're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of semicolons, colons, and commas. And under the chapter of semicolons, colons, and commas, right, there are two different lessons under the chapter, but today we're only going to focus on use semicolons and commas to separate clauses. So we're going to use semicolons and commas to separate clauses. All right. And in order for us to separate semicolons, commas, or to use semicolons, and commas to separate clauses, we need to first know what a semicolon is and also what a comma is, as well as its function. So let's go to a whiteboard first. So this is our chapter. We are doing semicolons, colons, and commas, grade 7, and our lesson for today is use semicolons and commas to separate clauses. We are doing the tutorial on aplusstudents.ca. So whenever you do feel like you want to go back, you can go on to aplusstudents.ca, go to the chapter, the specific grade, as well as the lesson, and then you can just recap on this specific chapter or lesson. All right, so now we're first going to find the difference between a semicolon and a comma. So when it comes to a semicolon, a semicolon, it connects two independent clauses. So it connects two independent clauses when they are related to each other. So it only connects two independent clauses when they are related to each other, right? And remember, we said independent clauses are basically clauses that can stand on its own, can stand on its own. But now the semicolon, it connects these two independent clauses when they are related to each other. We also use semicolons if items in a list already contain commas. So if you are listing items, right? Or you are making a list and you're listing down certain things, right? And remember, whenever we make a list, we, for example, say the word item or thing, comma, another thing, comma. So if items in a list already contain commas, that is when we use also a semicolon. And also semicolon is used with conjunctive verbs. semicolons is used with conjunctive verbs. And then we have a comma, right? All right, before we go to a comma, so semicolon is this little sign. It's a dot and a comma. So it's a dot and a comma. And then we have a comma, right? Say comma, we put before coordinating conjugations when we connect two independent clauses. So we can either put it in front of conjunction, right? Because that is basically what it's saying. We put it before a coordinating conjugation, which is like a conjunction when we connect the two independent clauses. Once again, independent clauses are clauses that can stand on its own. We also use a comma between dependent and independent clauses. So if within a sentence we have an independent clause and we are also connecting the dependent clause with the independent clause, then we put a comma between the two clauses. And then with a comma also, it will follow an introductory verb. So we're going to find out more about semicolons as well as commas as we are continuing our lesson. So a comma, it provides a gentle pause. So if you're reading something, right, or you are writing something, and then we basically put a comma, which basically provides a gentle pause. You are not putting a full stop. It's just a pause and we continue. So it provides a gentle pause between parts of a sentence and also connecting those parts to create an ordered, complete sentence. Because remember, when it comes to a sentence, later on, maybe within our different chapters, we will speak on run on words. So you need to put either some form of punctuation mark, such as a comma, to provide a gentle pause instead of just going on and on and on within a sentence. So we need to provide a gentle pause within a sentence by putting a comma, right, between either parts of a sentence or by putting a comma where we connect those parts to create an ordered, complete sentence. And then when it comes to a semicolon, right, a semicolon, it takes the job of the period and comma and combines them. And a period it's basically a full stop. The period, it ends a sentence. It's a full stop that ends a sentence. So we can either call it a period or we call it a full stop. And it ends the sentence. So a semicolon, it takes the job of the period, which is a full stop, and the comma, and it combines them. It combines them. And I think that is probably why the sign of a semicolon is a full stop on top and it has a comma at the bottom. It has a full stop on top and then it has a comma at the bottom. So at least now we know that it combines both comma as well as the full stop, which is the period. All right. So semicolon, right, it has two general uses. And with the semicolon, it is to either clarify a series, to indicate two closely related sentences, right? And we spoke about the independent clauses, right? So it is either to clarify a series or to indicate two closely related sentences, which can be or two independent sentences. And its series, if one or more element within the series contains a comma, we use a semicolon to separate them. And then we also use a semicolon between closely related independent clauses. Closely related independent clauses, which are now joined by a coordinating conjunction. And this rule, it means that semicolons are used between two completed sentences, and we said it is the independent clauses or sentences which are not already linked by words. So if it's not linked by words like and or but or no, for, or so, then that is when we use the semicolon. The semicolons are used between two complete sentences which are not already linked by words like and, but, or, no, for, or so. Because remember, if we have two independent clauses and we just join them by a coordinating conjunction, then that is basically like a compound sentence. It's where you're joining the two independent clauses to create basically one sentence. Once again, this is our sign of a semicolon, right? It's got a full stop at top, and then it has a comma at the bottom. And this is a punctuation mark. And this punctuation mark, which is the semicolon, it is used to separate parts of a sentence that is typically linking two complete ideas. The two complete ideas we spoke about is that independent sentences, independent clauses. So then we use a semicolon to separate the parts of a sentence. So that is a semicolon. And then also when it comes to commas, right? Semicolons. So how to use a semicolon? We see that when we use commas within a sentence, right? With a comma, you stop a little. It's like a little pause that you do. So at a comma, we stop a little or we pause a little. And then when it comes to a semicolon, it is somewhat more. So now we're going on to a comma. And a comma, it provides pauses in reading and speaking. And once again, we spoke about run on words, or we will be speaking on run on words. So, which means that if you do not either provide some form of pause within your sentences, then you will just have run on words, run on sentences, right? With no specific commas, no pauses. So you need to have pauses in reading, and that is where the comma or what the comma provides. The comma, it provides pauses in reading. It also provides pauses in speaking by separating parts of a sentence. Otherwise, we will just be blabbing words out without breathing, without pausing, without even taking a little, like stopping a little bit. An example that we have, it's raining. There's a comma. So let's grab our umbrellas. It's raining, so let's grab our umbrellas. And there we have our comma to bring about or provide pauses. And here it is separating it's raining from let's grab our umbrellas. So it separates parts of a sentence. So when it comes to commas, right? So commas before as. So there's a few rules when it comes to using commas and not using commas or not to use a comma. So when we write as, the comma before as can change the meaning of a sentence. So when we put a comma before as, then we can even change the meaning of a sentence. So basically, this is just an example of if we maybe put the comma before as. Because remember, we know that commas provide pauses in reading and speaking by separating parts in sentences. Also, when we use a comma before as, right, it can change the meaning of a sentence. For example, as I write, I love to read. It's basically it changes. So also, even though we use a comma before as, but we shouldn't use a comma before as when it's used as a conjunction. So if you use as a conjunction to join either words or sentences, or let's say to join sentences or clauses, right? And then we should not use a comma. We then also use a comma before and after as when it's used to set off a parenthetical phrase. For example, I love to read. Read, as you know, and I love to write. And remember, like we said, that when we use commas before as, right, it basically changes the meanings of that sentence, which means that the comma before as can affect the meaning of your sentence. All right, so we said that our tutorials are on aplusstudents.ca. So now we're going back to our tutorial, where we are only going to do use semicolons and colons to separate clauses. So we're going into our first lesson. So we need to, so we use a comma, right? We use a comma to separate two independent clauses that are joined with a conjunction. So if we have two independent clauses that is joined by a conjunction, we then use a comma in front of that specific words. And the conjunctions or the coordinating conjunctions, it is as, and, or, but, or, so. So that is the coordinating conjunctions. However, if the coordinating conjunction joins verbs or verb phrases in a compound predicate, a comma should not be used. And if we look at the two examples, Wyatt was reserved around new people, but he was hardly shy. Another example is, so basically, there you can see the but in front of that sentence. And then we have another example why it was reserved around new people, but was hardly shy. So you can either use it with a comma or without. So we also use a comma to separate dependent clauses and an independent clause when the dependent clause comes first. So if the dependent clause comes first, it's like we put our sentence comma and then you put the independent clause. So the dependent clause, it starts with a subordinating conjunction. And the subordinating conjunctions are after, although, or because. So that is the subordinating conjunctions. And we said that a comma, it also separates dependent clauses and an independent clause when the dependent clause comes first. And remember, the dependent clause, it needs the independent clause. And if we look at that sentence, it says, why it was reserved around new people, he was hardly shy. So that is a description as well as an explanation about commas or the use of commas. Now we have a semicolon. And how do we use semicolons, right? So we use semicolons to connect two independent clauses. That's joined with the conjunctive adverb. So we use semicolons to connect two independent clauses that are joined with a conjunctive adverb. And the few conjunctive adverbs are consequently, however, or therefore. And if we look at an example of how a semicolon is used to connect to two independent clauses and how it is joined by a conjunctive adverb, the example is Wyatt was hardly shy. There we have a semicolon. Nevertheless, that is our conjunctive adverb. He was reserved around new people. So Wyatt was hardly shy. Nevertheless, he was reserved around new people. So in this case, right, this clause, it was joined by a conjunctive adverb, which is nevertheless. All right, so now we're going to either add a comma or a semicolon if needed. So we're going to use a comma, or we're going to use a semicolon if needed. And then we're going to submit the text without any additional punctuations. The word soccer originated in Britain, but today the British uniformly call the sport football. And when soccer gained popularity in America in the 1980s, the British wanted to differentiate themselves. Consequently, the term soccer fell out of favor with them. So we're going to read that again. The word soccer, right, it was originated in Britain. But today, the British uniformly call the sport football. And when soccer gained popularity in America in 1980s, the British wanted to differentiate themselves. Consequently, the term soccer fell out of favor with them. Where am I? All right, so if we either put a comma or a semicolon, right? These are the two clauses, right? It's two independent clauses that is joined by a conjunctive adverb. And the conjunctive adverb that was used within that sentence is consequently. So if the sentence is joined or completed with the word consequently, it means that we are going to put a semicolon in front of the word consequently. So here we put the semicolon for consequently. And remember, we said that the semicolon, it connects two independent clauses that are joined with the conjunctive adverb. And consequently being one of them. We're going on to the next one. In 1879, Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler formed the innovative architectural firm Adler and Sullivan. The two designed more than 100 buildings that are considered treasures of architecture. So we need to either add a comma or we need to add a semicolon if needed. So if we reread our sentence again, right? It says in 1879, Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler formed the innovative architectural firm Adler and Sullivan. The two designed more than 100 buildings that are considered treasure of architecture. So we either need to add a comma or a semicolon. So if we add a comma or semicolon, right, and then we're going to add it here next to Adler and Sullivan. So we added our semicolon just in front or just after Sullivan. And in this case, in our sentence, right, there are two closely related independent clauses that are joined with a coordinating conjunction. So you should complete the sentence with a semicolon. You did. Alan Pinkerton moved to the United States from Scotland and he started a famous private detective agency in Chicago. So Alan Pinkerton moved to the United States from Scotland and he started a famous private detective agency in Chicago. We are now going to have to either choose the comma or the semicolon if needed within a specific sentence. All right. So if we So what we're going to do is the two independent clauses are joined with a coordinating conjunction, which is and. So you should then complete the sentence with a comma. And remember when we use a coordinating conjunction and, we put the comma in front of that word, which is either and or so but. And we put it over. There we go. And that is Alan Pinkerton moved to the United States from Scotland. And he started a famous private chief detective agency in Chicago. So that is where we add our comma just before the conjunction, which is and. All right. Let's go next to look at a few more activities or questions. We already did that one. In, no, we did that one. Where is the other one? We did that one. I think it's the same ones. All right. Until humans began cultivating plants and animals for food about 10,000 years ago, all people obtained their food by hunting, gathering, and fishing. So until humans began cultivating plants and animals for food about 10,000 years ago, all people obtained their food by hunting, gathering, and fishing. So we either need to put a comma or a semicolon within that sentence. So we're basically going to put a comma because it says that the dependent clause is until humans began cultivating plants and animals for food about 10 years ago comes before the independent clause. So you should complete the sentence with a comma. So although Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a sometimes controversial leader, he is the only American president to have been elected to office 4 times. So we need to either put a comma within the sentence or a semicolon within the sentence. So although Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sometimes controversial leader, he is the only American president to have been elected to office 4 times. So basically, we are going to put a comma, right? And we said that it has two independent clauses, but the independent clause, although Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sometimes controversial leader, it comes before the independent clause. So you should complete the sentence with a comma. So we're going to put a comma. So you put the comma by although. So although, comma. All right, let us go to our test. So we're going to put a comma or we're going to put a semicolon if needed. Groundwater comes from underground reservoirs called aquifers, and we rely on these sources to meet half of our water needs in the United States. So groundwater comes from underground reservoirs called aquifers, and we rely on these sources to meet half of our water needs in the United States. So now we need to either put a comma or semicolon when needed. So is it option one? Groundwater comes from underground reservoirs called aquifers, comma, and we rely on these sources to meet half of our water needs in the United States, or groundwater comes from underground reservoirs called, comma, aquifers and rely on these sources to meet half of our water needs. So if we were to put the correct either semicolon or let's say comma within the sentence, then we will put the comma before and, meaning groundwater comes from underground reservoirs called aquifers, and we rely on these sources to meet half of our water needs in the United States. So we put the comma in front of and. Wild Leaks is a whistleblower website where people anonymously report illegal wildlife trade. The site may prove effective in the fight against wildlife crimes. However, it requires internet access in order to be useful. Now we need to either put a semicolon or we're going to put a comma. So Wild is at option one, which is Wild Leaks, is a whistleblower website where people anonymously report illegal wildlife trade. This site may prove effective in the crime against wildlife crime. There we have, however, it requires internet access in order to be useful. So we're going to go with the option one, where we put the semicolon in front of however. Shrek, a New Zealand sheep, went 6 years without being shorn. So his fleas weighed 60 pounds when it was really cut. So Shrek, a New Zealand sheep, went 6 years without being shorn. So his fleas weighed 60 pounds when it was finally cut. So now we either need to put a semicolon or a comma. So is it option one, which is Shrek, a New Zealander sheep, went 6 years without being shorn, so his fleas weighed 60 pounds when we finally cut it. So in this case, there we have a conjunction, right? And the conjunctions, we said coordinating conjunction. It basically has a comma in front of it. So we're going to choose option two. And there we have the comma in front of the conjunction. Airplane food has a reputation for being unappetizing. But the food itself may not be responsible. Researchers have discovered that high altitude and decreased humidity dull or dull our ability to detect flavors. So airplane food has a reputation for being unappetizing, but the food itself may not be responsible. Researchers have discovered that high altitude and decreased humidity dull our ability to detect flavors. So now we are going to either put a semicolon where needed or a comma. So do we say airplane food has a reputation for being appetizing, comma, but the food itself may not be responsible, or option two, which is airplane food has a reputation for being appetizing, comma, semicolon, but the food itself may not be responsible. So we either need to put a comma or a semicolon. All right, let's choose random ones. So we chose a random one, right? So which means that we don't put a semicolon, we need to put a comma. So if you do get a, like for example, something incorrect, you can always just scroll down or go to the place where you will find the right one, copy the link, send it to us, and you will get 100 bonus points, which means that we were supposed to put comma just after appetizing. All right. So that is now the use of semicolons and commas to separate clauses, right? And we went over what a semicolon is as well as what a comma is. So, grade 7, thank you very much for joining our lesson. This is now the end of our lesson on semicolons, colons, and commas. So next time we are going to go over colons, and the lesson that we did was use and semicolons and commas to separate clauses. All right, so that is the end of our lessons, grade 7. You should have a good evening further.